Chapter 8, Listening. We're going to review multiple topics in this chapter: the nature of listening, challenge of listening, the components of listening, and the different types of listening responses. I find that listening is one of the areas that most of us are weak in. We don't realize how detailed, how important it is to listen. We have so much going on in our head. We're trying to get to our next stop, if you will. It's just a busy thought process happening in our heads throughout our days, and so we cut corners with listening. We're going to cover these main objectives, and I hope that by the end of this chapter we will have met each of these, that you'll be familiar with the nature of listening, different listening styles, what are some of the challenges that we face, what are the 5 components of the interpersonal listening process, and how to use these reflective and directive tips to help you engage as a better listener and becoming a more competent communicator. So the nature of listening. I love this image on the right of the slide. It is an image provided from, I believe it's a Chinese graphic that reminds us that the word listening involves your ears, your eyes, your undivided attention, and your heart. So this is how the word listen is written in that language. And it involves these 4 pieces, which I think is absolutely wonderful. So listening is the most frequent form that we use in our communication activity on a regular basis. Listening is the process of receiving and responding to other messages. So in our communication transactional model, in that middle section where the messages are being shared, that's where listening takes place. Remember, though, that in this Chinese word, that it includes 4 parts: the ear, the eyes, undivided attention, and the heart. Can you put those 4 together and see how important they are to make up listening? Listening involves much more undivided attention and heart, as we could see in the previous slide. Listening is the reconstruction of what we're hearing. Hearing is just sound waves, sounds that are coming through, the vibrations that are being transmitted to our brain, letting us know that there's sound going on. And listening takes those impulses and gives them meaning. So there's much more involved in listening. As previously mentioned, listening involves so many parts. And today, not just today, I think forever, listening has been a very important skill to have. The ability to listen is a skill that employers look for. I think if you develop this skill, it would be such a great asset. And listening also is found in the reading of messages. So if you receive a text, an email, read it carefully. Make sure you don't miss any points. Like with your homework, some students read through it quickly and they just submit whatever. But break down what the message says. What are you required to do? You're required in a discussion to reply to 2 classmates. You're required to write minimum 100-word thoughtful responses. Those details are really important. Even in a written document, the details that come in those written words are tied to your listening abilities. When we think about the nature of listening, there are important aspects of listening. So how we react to others, sometimes it becomes routinely automatic, and it can disrupt our listening ability. So mindless listening occurs when we're interacting with people on a regular basis, right? And everything's automatic. Maybe you work with someone or you interact with someone that you already know ahead of time they're going to have this reaction. And so you don't give them the full attention of listening. And that establishes an environment of mindless listening. So you're just operating automatically. Where mindful listening allows for careful and thoughtful attention, not only to the messages that you're receiving, but to the responses that you're delivering. So mindful listening is part of our goal as a competent communicator. And it's not always easy. We're humans. We have our days. We have our good days. We have our bad days. But try to practice mindful listening in everything that you do. There are multiple listening styles. We are going to focus on the 4 primary styles that have been identified in our textbook: task-oriented, relational, analytical, and critical listening. Earlier, when I mentioned mindfulness and mindlessness, those 2 components can impact our listening styles. When you are in a class or at work or working on any project in general, whether you're a volunteer or you're being paid to do the job, you need to be able to understand that when you're listening, you're using a specific style, and being able to identify which style is best suited for the environment that you're in is, again, an enhancement to your listening skills. So a task-oriented listening is most concerned with efficiency and accomplishing a specific job. So when you're being given instructions at work, trying to understand what the processes are, that is task-oriented. Relational listening is most concerned or focused on building closeness with others in relationships. So you could be at work, have just come out of a meeting where you've used your task-oriented style, but now you're collaborating with a coworker, and so that would be a little more relational. The analytical listening allows you to attend a full message, but also provide your input. So let's say on that same story, you're at work, came out of a meeting, received a project, you connected and collaborated with a couple of your workmates, and you've shared a little bit about what's been going on in your day, your morning, your life, etc. Now it's time to do some analytical listening. So we're going to start to hear ideas. How should we approach this? When should we start? What should we include? What should we exclude? That's analytical listening. What works? What doesn't work? And then critical listening is used to evaluate. For example, it could be used at work, but could also be used it could be used in a task-oriented environment. It could also be used in a relational environment. So when you're listening critically to someone who says, I need your advice, these are the options that I have, and I'm thinking of going this way. So as part of critical listening, you're going to provide input. You're going to be honest and direct. So the 4 listening styles, task-oriented, relational, analytical, and critical, are all part of our own listening experience. What are some of the challenges or the barriers in listening? First of all, I think most people think that hearing and listening are one and the same when they're not. Remember that hearing is just getting the vibration of the sounds. Listening is when you're actually interpreting what you're hearing. So these barriers that we encounter that happen when we're listening, it's not an easy skill to develop, and we have so many barriers. 4 listed on this slide. Information overload. When you've had that day and everything that could have come your way has come your way, and you keep getting hit left and right, you're starting to get irritable. By the time you get home, you just don't want to hear anything else. It's just too much. You can't keep up with it. Information overload. And it becomes more of a mindless type of listening towards the end of your day. Personal concerns can come into your listening, and while we don't want to be distracted, especially with people that we are close to, anything that's of an immediate concern, a personal concern, can engage in our listening. It can be a barrier that prevents us from giving complete attention, mindful attention to someone. Rapid thought is another barrier because it can get in the way of our active brains. Somebody might be sharing about a plan for tomorrow, and you're already on the following day. And so that rapid thought, you're trying to get someone to hurry up, get to the point so that I can get to my next point. So rapid thoughts are horrible barriers, but I'm one of those that I will find myself in that process. So mindful listening is so important. And if you have to slow things down, that's okay. It's not going to change the outcome. And then we've heard of noise. We first got introduced to noise in our transactional communication process. Those squiggly lines in the process that break up the messages. And noise could be background noise. Noise could be thoughts in our head, judgment that's going on in our head. Noise can be a distraction of any kind. So noise is a barrier. So the challenges that we face with listening include these 4 barriers: information overload, personal concerns, rapid thought, and noise. So as I look at this list of 7 points, I can find many that I have engaged in. These are habits that we develop, habits that we're unaware of that exist. We just develop them. It's so common. Pseudo listening, stage hogging, selective listening, filling in the gaps, insulated listening, defensive listening, and ambushing. Let's take a look at these briefly. So pseudo listening is an imitation of actually listening, very much on the mindless list, where you're having someone talking. I've been accused of this, especially when I have a conversation on the phone where I can just put it on mute and keep doing what I'm doing while the person is sharing what they are sharing, pseudo listening. But even in a face-to-face interaction, you can be looking at someone and not hear a word that they say. So very bad habit. Stage hogging occurs when people are only interested in expressing their own ideas. They don't care about what the other person or anyone else has to say. They are stage hogging, focused on one thing, and that is what they have to say. Selective listening occurs when we're looking for a particular response. We're trying to get part of the message that impacts me the most or interests me the most, and then I reject everything else. Can you think of when you've done one of these top 3? Give it some thought. Filling in the gaps, definitely something that I have done. It's almost like part of interrupting someone, where they're starting to share something and then you pop in and say, no, that's not exactly how it happened. It happened this way. Or maybe your perspective is different from the other person. And so we have to remember that we all bring different pieces to the environment. And so filling in the gaps, definitely something I need to work on. Insulated listening. So when we listen, well, we're not really listening actually. When a listener is avoiding, they don't want to deal with it, kind of like the muting that I just mentioned earlier on the phone. So that's insulated listening, where it could kind of connect with pseudo listening, but this is more direct, where the listener just doesn't want to deal with what's being said. And then defensive listening. That is where you take an innocent comment and take it as a personal attack. And that can happen in the mix of all the parts of communication process. The verbals, the nonverbals, everything that's coming at you. You could try to interpret everything and interpret it completely wrong. So we need to be careful of these poor habits. And then finally, we have ambushing. And ambushing is listening carefully to collect information so that we can turn around and use it against the person. The components of listening, as we connect our challenges with listening, we also need to understand what are the components. Why are we listening, right? So we're listening to hear, to understand, to attend, having listening fidelity, which is mindfulness, also remembering and responding. So we know that hearing is the physiological aspect of listening. Attending is more of the psychological part of that mindful listening aspect, where we begin to select information and start translating that into some meaning. And many people are convinced that they can attend to multiple messages at one time. And while multitasking is possible, when it comes to listening, there has to be an effective way on how you're doing that. So research doesn't back the claim that because our brain can process a lot, that we will be completely attending to all of the information that we're receiving. So we can process a lot of information at one time, but what are the impairments of the information that we're attending? What are we missing? Cognitively, are we picking everything up? Understanding allows us to attach meaning, and listening fidelity is the degree in which we connect the information that the sender is trying to communicate, and we translate that effectively. Remembering is the ability to recall the information that we have received and understood, and responding is giving noticeable, valuable feedback. So these are the components of listening: hearing, attending, understanding, listening fidelity, remembering, and responding. In our textbook, they address the dark side of whatever the topic is, and we have found that every aspect in our communication journey does have a dark side, and multitasking has been identified as that dark side because we have the ability to do a lot at once, to hear a lot at once, to receive a lot at once. It takes tremendous skill to receive that accurately. So there are challenges. Many of us might claim to be multitaskers, but do we do it effectively? And are we efficient at all of the details? Good listeners are going to ask questions, provide reflective responses. So listening responses are really important to the success of our communication interaction. So a good listener, as mentioned, will ask questions for clarification, try to provide feedback as clear as possible, offer a perspective that is beneficial, and that is my own perspective, not imposing on the other person, and include some nonverbals to validate what you are saying. So these 4 points highlighted in listening responses of a good listener. On this slide, we can see the difference between a less reflective response, where it's more directive, and a more reflective, less directive. So we can see that in the types of responses, when we look at silent listening, it's more reflective. We're not really saying too much. Questioning is starting to move towards the reflective, but it is less directive. So questioning is more reflective, less directive. As we move over to paraphrasing, empathizing, analyzing, supporting, evaluating, and advising, we can see that those are a more reflective approach. Now, which is the best approach? You just have to use your ability of interpreting and trusting that you have strength and understanding when silent listening is important in the interaction that's taking place. So silent listening allows you to remain attentive and not to verbally respond. I have found silent listening to benefit in interactions where somebody's very emotional, cathartic, maybe there's a tragedy that has just occurred and there's really not much that can be said, but just providing support and using my nonverbals, maybe holding a hand, offering a hug, or just making that eye contact with that person. That's an example of where I think silent listening might be appropriate. What about you? Can you think of some? Maybe you've already interacted in those engagements. Well, we will not have a discussion about this short clip, but I hope that you find it of interest and can consider what some of the downsides are and what are the upsides of when you might talk to someone or even a total stranger. Also, as a reminder, you need to go back to the PowerPoint file to get these links. So continuing on the types of listening, we mentioned silent listening. Another type is questioning, and that's where we're asking for more information. There has to be a level of sincerity in this clarification to learn more about the situation, learn more about the person's feelings. We can use open questions to get more information, and closed questions will allow a limited range of answers, whereas open questions would be open to getting a lot of feedback. Encourage the person to discover through the input that you're providing, through the response. Maybe they can discover more things, allow them to elaborate. It helps you to gather more facts and to just bring together the complete story. So questioning is very helpful. But just remember, your approach to questioning has to be mindful. Along the lines of questioning, we also have types of questions that can be on the negative. So some questions can be sincere, as in the previous slide, and some can be what's identified as a counterfeit question. It's disguised to gather more information and to send a message rather than to receive one. So these counterfeit questions can trap a speaker. They can create a statement that's untrue. They can carry hidden agendas. They can seek a positive judgment. So these questions are counterfeit questions that we need to be careful about our motivations. And also, if you're on the flip side of this, as the communicator here, we're looking at our responsibility as a competent communicator. But if you're engaged in a situation where you're being questioned, be sure to be alert and recognize when you're being approached with counterfeit questions. Do not allow yourself to be trapped. Another type of response is paraphrasing. And paraphrasing is an amazing strategy for clarification. It's the feedback that restates the message that was just sent. And it's often very helpful. Often I'll use it as an instructor where I will say, okay, I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. Is this what you said? Or is this your circumstance? Help me validate that I'm understanding exactly what you are sharing. So these are three strategies for paraphrasing on this slide. And so we need to be very careful that we're not changing the speaker's wording. We're seeking clarification. So we want to make sure we understand their underlying theme. Paraphrasing strategies can be positive and negative. So keep an eye out for that, or an ear actually out for it with your listening skills. Paraphrasing factual information. I have somebody that just went through something. They were being interviewed and they had read an article and gave some statistics in the interview, and they got really nervous. Oh, maybe I quoted it incorrectly. So when you're paraphrasing factual information, it's really great to identify in your statement that you're summarizing. I recently read an article, and I believe in that article it referenced something to the effect of. I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but this is what I recall. And so that's really important in factual information. And then paraphrasing personal information requires just some more sensitivity, mindfulness, where you can just be more sensitive to what's being shared and how it's being shared. But I do encourage paraphrasing in all opportunities that you're given in a conversation to paraphrase. I think it strengthens the understanding and the conversation, and I believe it also develops trust. So we're familiar with the term empathy, and there is a listening response that's tied to empathy. So we're able to use this response to identify with the speaker. We can identify by acknowledging their emotions, validating. It's a little more than just paraphrasing, repeating what they said, but saying, I understand how you feel. I've been there before. There's no evaluation. If it's more of an agreement or support to what is being shared. When listeners are denying the other person their feelings, or they're minimizing the situation, oh, it really wasn't as bad as you thought it was, just focusing off of the speaker, that could not be empathy. Empathy, whether we agree with what we experienced is the same, You don't want to rain on the speaker's parade. You want to validate them. And then later, when the emotions are less high, you can talk about the situation from a different perspective. Again, this is a link to another short video. If the video is required, I will mention it. But I do highly encourage that you watch them because I think they will help you in your own journey and your development. Brene Brown is a well-known communicator that has provided so much research in the last 10 years that has been very helpful with interactions amongst people, especially when you're dealing with empathy. Another type of listening response is supporting, where you're providing some solidarity with your speaker's situation. You're supporting them, supporting their responses. You're showing agreement, maybe offering to help, praising them for their courage, giving them reassurance. None of us are perfect, but I think you did a great job. And then diversion. So you want to be able to help them understand, okay, this situation did happen, but let's move on to the next part or the next step. So support is really beneficial when the expression is sincere, when the speaker is willing to accept your support, and just being present in that interaction. So these listening responses are quite beneficial. There's so many parts to our listening that I hope that you're gaining information, you're understanding of certain situations you've encountered and where you didn't know why it went wrong. Maybe it just had to do with a different approach to listening. Well, we don't have the opportunity to discuss this slide. I thought it was helpful to think about it. How do you respond when someone tells you about a difficult issue? How do you provide help? I had a tragedy in my household. My eldest son died in an automobile accident, and it was pretty horrible. And I think one of the most difficult challenges for me in that process, amongst all the other pain that came with that emotionally, was people wanting to give me answers rather than just listening to me. I just wanted to be heard. I didn't want people to fix it because we couldn't fix it. But I just wanted them to be empathetic and to listen and just hold me rather than try to fix me. So it's important to think about how your responses can highly benefit someone or maybe put them in a worse emotional state. Think about it for a moment. Another type of listening response is analyzing. We offer interpretation of what we think, as I shared earlier. Analyzing is when the listeners are offering an interpretation of the message. And it can be helpful, but it can also work against the situation. So when you're offering an interpretation, be mindful of it. Be tentative, like not be sure, right? Don't say like it's a fact, but I think what I'm seeing here is, so your analysis in your response should have a reasonable openness so that it can be changed. So make sure that the other person is receptive to it and that your offering is truly going to help the other person. I think the motive behind it is really important. I know in my situation that I shared earlier is a difficult one, highly sensitive, and people, their motives came from a good place, but they weren't being mindful of the moment and how I was feeling in that 24, 72-hour period. I think evaluating responses will occur when we offer information that is just not being received. So I think that we need to be very cautious about how, and I mentioned the word tentative, and I want you to consider being tentative. You know, we often think that our advice is best, or we can see things clearly in the different stages that we are, the different decades that we're in. We always think that. And that's good, because we probably do have the answers, but we need to be very careful when we are offering unhelpful advice. We don't want to send an unwelcomed message. We want people to take responsibility, but we have to be very gentle. So we want them to be ready to accept that advice. So be very cautious as a listener to step into a realm where it's going to be unhelpful. Advising, offering help is a common reaction to someone's situation. In my situation, that's what everybody wanted to do. But the emotions were high, and I was feeling like, I can't take this anymore. I really had to isolate. Why it may not be helpful, there's different reasons why it may not be helpful. I'm going to pause till that siren passes. Apologize for the background noise as we're listening. Gives you an idea of where I might be. Yeah, I'm in a high rise right now in the middle of a city that can get really noisy. Okay, reasons why it may not always be helpful to advise. It may not be the best suggestion, but you've got to be mindful of what's happening around you. You may not be in a position to provide the advice, so your textbook uses the term as unwelcomed identity, so your role in that exchange is really important. Also, just making sure you're not making a decision for someone. When you're offering advice, you always want to give options. And so we want to be able to offer options and give the person an opportunity to make their own choice and to support that choice, even if you disagree with it. So which response should I use? I encourage you to think about everything that you have learned up until this chapter. All of them come together to help you become a competent communicator. And when it comes to responding, you need to have all the pieces together. You will only get better at what your communication results are by applying these points that you have learned, not only in your personal communication, personal relations, but at work, in professional settings. Begin to challenge yourself and apply them. Label what you're doing. Think about the terms that we've learned and how you can apply them. When is giving advice appropriate? Or when is analyzing appropriate? Those are the types of things that you need to match with the environment that you're in. Become an expert at it. You will gain so much from learning how to apply these circumstances, these techniques in your day-to-day communication. This concludes our lecture for this chapter. I hope that you have found it satisfying, along with your textbook, to understand what the nature of listening is, the different listening styles, the challenges that can impede effective listening, what the components of listening process involve, and what are some of those responses.